On this morning's Ag Issues program, as always, a pleasure to bring on to the program Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the program this morning. Roger, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Greg. Just fine. I think, however, you need to have the weather guy go back and check his work. That didn't sound good.
No, we will definitely talk with him about that for going back to this Arctic air once again, too.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of the issues you wanted to discuss today. And, of course, buying farmland, that's something that still is very much taking place as far as not only here in Kansas, but in other areas as well. And as we all know, it is a major decision, but there are several things, Roger, that if you're interested in buying farmland that you need to consider. And you think about it, and that it's little things can turn into big things, and big things that can turn into bigger things. So let's just go through it, and probably right at the top of the list is doing your due diligence on environmental issues.
Yeah, that's true, Greg. I would say one thing before we get into that, however, is, sometimes all of this that we're going to talk about gets thrown out the window when the tract next to you that's not been on the market in the past 50 to 60 years finally becomes available. And because it's adjacent to you, you really want that piece. And so just about everything else that I'm going to say sometimes is going to go in one ear and out the other when you have a situation like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not, well, it's just tempting. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but nonetheless, like you said, that if it's there and you're thinking, I've always wanted that as you well know, sometimes that interest is very much a very big interest, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. You may be thinking this is my only shot to get it, so you're gonna do it. But anyway, when we get into the environmental issues, let's just start with that. Both at the state and federal level, there are a lot of things to think about. One of these, many of these farms and ranches have old dump sites on them. There are places where there may be a ravine. Old appliances may be down in there, tractor tires, vehicle tires, old vehicles may be dumped down in there. And the question that comes up is, does that present any liability issues for you in terms of environmental cleanup? There's going to be chemicals, there's going to be oil, there might be fuel associated with that. What's my potential liability with respect to that? And, you get into a bad situation and it perhaps could be designated as a cleanup site. I've seen that in some egregious cases across the country where somebody bought a farm or a ranch and it turns out that it was really bad. They didn't find it. They didn't do what you indicated, due diligence, in terms of asking questions, trying to become an innocent purchaser under federal law so that you're not responsible for that cleanup. And that gets into, and some states, by the way, have statutes that require the seller to fill out a detailed disclosure document that discloses the use of the property, what they know about what they've done on the property in terms of environmental issues that might arise. And those statutes will require the seller to sign off on that. And the whole purpose of that is to have the buyer be deemed to be an innocent purchaser. And that's a defense under the federal Superfund law. State laws may dovetail into that. And so you want to make sure you're not buying a property that's going to create an issue like that. You don't want to have chemicals leaking into a water source that could go off-site. You want to also make, and I'll come back to this later, but I want to reemphasize this and start out emphasizing it. You want to always walk the property. That's a common sense thing. Get aerial pictures of it, but get your boots on the ground. Walk the property, inspect it. Look for areas where grass is not growing. It looks like it's been burned out. That's a pretty good indication there's been maybe oil spillage, other types of chemicals that have scoured that ground. And especially on farms and ranches, we do a lot of machinery and equipment maintenance work on the farm. That may or may not actually be in a building. If it's outside in a barnyard or some other area, there may be areas that you can see where the soil has been contaminated. Well, you want to know if whether that will or will not create a liability issue for you. So some of those types of things.
And that also part, or somewhat a part of the what's called CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, too?
Yeah, that's the technical term for the Superfund law. I remember growing up as a kid, I'd see these pictures on the evening news of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. I grew up on our family's farm in Indiana, and I thought that was pretty cool. That river's on fire. And I remember asking my dad, how did they get that river to burn? He said, that's not a good thing, son. That's because of all the garbage that's in the river. And so that was a Superfund site. Love Canal in New York was a Superfund site. The Valley of the Drums down in Kentucky, where they had buried chemical drums and oil drums and then inadvertently drilled into it. And that was kind of the same thing in Love Canal. We can get, there are lots of chemicals that are used on farms and ranches, pesticides, oil, fuel, diesel fuel, all types of things. And if they're not disposed of properly, or there's an old dump site, that can create an issue. And that's why you want that disclosure document to be an innocent purchaser under that Superfund law so that you're not pegged with liability.
And to say the least, then, one of the things you should take a very close look at, depending on the situation with the piece of land that you have, is looking at the drainage records.
Yeah, in some parts of the country, this is a big deal. Now, you get into central and western Kansas and further west and throughout the plains states, it's not that big of an issue. But in eastern Kansas and points through the eastern Corn Belt, eastern Nebraska, all across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, that land is drained. And there are underground tile drains. And public records are a good place to look for information about a tract of farmland concerning those drainage records. So check those records at the local auditor's office, at least in some states. That's where the records are contained. And that's a good place to get that drainage information. Now, they may not be in the recorder's records. They probably won't show up in an abstract. But maybe you can get some FSA records, you can get aerial photos, maybe the seller will provide those to you, and there may be private drainage agreements or easements that exist, and those will likely be recorded, and they'll appear in the recorder's office on the records for the property. But what are the what is the drainage on the property? Where does it tie into? Do you have laterals in the field? Is it in a drainage district? What are the drainage assessments? You want to know all of that information if you're in eastern Kansas and points east across the country where that land has all been tile drained.
Roger, I would assume, too, that you can get a lot more information potentially through USDA records such as Farm Service Agency and NRCS records.
Yeah, that's a good place to get your hands on maps and documents, and they'll also allow the buyer to determine if there are any government contracts or easements on the property, such as CRP payments. Is it subject to a CRP contract? Is it in the Wetlands Reserve Program, and so forth? And that USD information will also allow the buyer to determine if any of that land is highly erodible or has wetland status. And wetland status is important to us in ag from two perspectives. One is the USDA perspective, because you might have swamp buster rules that come into play. And the other one, of course, on the wetland side of things, is the federal EPA Corps of Engineer designation that could then tie you into a water of the United States, and then you could have big restrictions on you, other than just planting a crop and converting a wetland into crop production under swamp buster. So you got that dual concern in some instances with respect to farmland.
Well, the point being in all this as well, you talked about due diligence right off the bat, that we know that if a governmental agency gets involved, that this is a process that can last way, 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 way too long, too.
Oh, Greg, I was involved in a case, actually went to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals in the late 1990s. That case involved 25 years of litigation when you count the state level involvement and then the federal level involvement, involving a 450 acre hay meadow in the Sandhills of Nebraska. Over 2 decades of litigation, absolutely horrible for the family once the government gets involved. And that was all because a neighbor wanted to acquire their farm and wanted to put them out of business. And so they got them tied up in the administrative bureaucracy. Now, the family eventually won that, but didn't get full resolution of that until both of the owners, mom and dad, had died. That's how bad this stuff can get.
A couple other things on that as well that could be issues. How important is it to look at what the existing lease is and how that is set up too?
Oh, that's incredibly important. And there still are a lot of misconceptions on this. It's always amazing to me, no matter how long I talk about a particular topic, and I think that I've beaten a horse into death and then continue to beat the dead horse by talking about it, but there are still a lot of misconceptions about leases and when you buy farmland. The rule in Kansas, as it is in just about every other jurisdiction, is when you buy farmland that has a lease on it, you are buying subject to the existing lease. And then you, as the buyer, assume the responsibility under state law to properly terminate that lease. Now, that's the case if we have an oral farm lease. That oral farm lease is going to continue. If you have a written lease on that property, then you have to look at the terms of what that current owner has with respect to that lease as to when it terminates. And often it will say if the land sells, then that's a termination event. But many times these leases are oral, and so the buyer is assuming the lease and therefore assuming the obligation under state law to give proper notice to terminate that tenancy. The other concern that you have is you want to make sure that you know who the tenant is. And if there is more than one tenant, you want to properly notice all of those tenants that have an interest in the property. The last thing you want to have happen is some undisclosed tenant that pops up after you thought you'd given notice to the tenant that was discoverable. One pops out of the weeds and said, "Well, I'm also on this lease. Look at the documents down at the FSA office. We're splitting payments, and I didn't get my notice." I've actually had that come up. I've had practitioners call me and say, "What do you do in this situation?" I've got a 90-some-year-old widow in a nursing home that now says that she's a tenant and the new buyer didn't give notice. The landowner in that situation didn't even know that person existed. The tenant had put a family member on the FSA documents for purposes of gaming the payment limitation system, and then the land changed hands, and then they claimed, "Well, your notice is not effective. You didn't name this other person," and the landowner didn't even know that person existed. They never dealt with them. So you want to check. You want to try to check all these things off. Get the seller to sign off on who the tenant is, and check as many public records as you possibly can. This can become a mess, and also determine what ownership interest the owner has. There are a lot of surviving spouses that have a life estate interest in that real estate, and then it's going to go to the remainderment, perhaps the children. Who are you dealing with? Make sure that you understand what the relationship is of the current owner. Do they have a fee simple interest? Is it a life estate interest? Who are the parties you're dealing with? And particularly, who are the parties that are dealing with the current tenant on the property? Lots of legal issues there. Just don't assume it's simple. It often is not simple.
Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, is joining us. And Roger, a couple other things on to consider before buying farmland. And one thing to take a look at, and you may not think about, is local development plans, say such as wind turbines are put up, solar panels, something like that.
Yeah, you want to be careful on that one. You want to make sure that you check public records, maybe county commissioner or board of supervisors meeting minutes, local newspaper, archive stories, talk to neighbors, see if there's any plans in the works for either a solar farm, we're seeing those now, or a wind farm with these large turbines going to be put up, because those can affect the value of your property. It's pretty well documented that they can affect the value of your property in a negative way if you don't have those on you, because they're going to affect the view shed, particularly the turbines, and the solar farms too. You want to be careful with respect to that. I do carry I put a case in my treatise on agricultural law involving a New York purchase of a farm, and it wasn't disclosed that there were already plans in the works for a large-scale wind farm to be in the viewshed of that, and the buyer wanted out of the contract. It went to the trial court for the trial court to determine whether that contract could be rescinded or not. They ultimately settled that case. But you want to make sure that you're not buying something, then the value is going to be sucked out from underneath you. And that's the big problem and the big concern with respect to that.
Well, and you talked about the property, the value of the land itself. Boy, valuation of that is going to help you out as to determine what the price or what you think the fair price is.
That's exactly right. So that's why you want to know all of these things we've been talking about, because all of it ultimately bears on value. And economic margins are thin in agriculture. And if you're going to use this property as part of your production operation, you want to make sure that you're paying the appropriate price for it and not more than what it's ultimately going to be worth. Greg, there's currently a case in the U.S. Supreme Court out of Idaho for these people, and I think you and I talked about it because it was in my top 10 list that we talked about a few weeks ago. And they bought this property to put a home on it in northern Idaho next to a lake, and the government comes in and said, well, you know, this dry spot on your property, that's actually connected to this lake that is this river that is a water of the United States, and so therefore you've got a wetland, you can't develop it. Well, you take your development of potential out of that property, then there goes your value. And so that's a big hit for them, and that's a major case that's before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. That's the last thing you want to have happen to you if you buy a farm.
We've given them a lot to think about. Another thing to think about is taxes. Once you get this, and, you know, whatever the purchase price is, you know, how much of that can be allocated to depreciable items.
Yeah, you want to make sure you do that, because if you're buying a farm that's got good fences on it, it's got farm structures on it, maybe it's got some buildings, a grain drying facility, storage facilities, drainage tile, we talked about that. Does it have a feeding floor? You want to be able to put some of the purchase price, have allocated to those items, because then you're going to set that up and depreciate it. Another one that we can get into in eastern Kansas, particularly northeastern Kansas, is residual fertilizer supply. Is there excess fertilizer that's on that? If so, how long will it last? Can I allocate some of the value to that residual fertilizer supply and depreciate that, amortize that over the next 3 to 5 years? That actually is a huge, huge issue in north central Iowa. And you'll see sometimes the IRS will usually, if you do it right, just grant you 5% of the purchase price. Well, if you're buying a $10,000 per acre farm and being able to allocate 5% of the purchase price on a per acre basis, that's a big deal. Doing those types of things will effectively drop the purchase price, your out-of-pocket cost on that farmland. So you want to pay attention to that and get those cost allocations done properly.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I know you've got a couple other things we wanted to talk about, but also wanted to get into the fact that coming up this Wednesday, you're going to be down in Ottawa with us concerning your presentation at our Farm Profit Seminar, and we're talking about, well, not buying land, but talking about farm succession.
Yeah, that's another huge issue, and glad to be with you Wednesday, and I appreciate the invitation. And that's an important topic. We've got a lot of farmland in Kansas as well as across the country. It's going to change hands this decade. And if the intent is to keep that land in the family intact as a viable economic operation into the future, then there are certain things that we have to do properly, and we need to get set up now. So I've encouraged people that are in the area that are thinking about those issues to come. That's what I'll be talking about. And then you've got some other great speakers too that evening. It's going to be a great night.
All right. Roger, as always, appreciate it. And thanks, and we'll see you Wednesday night.
Thank you, Greg.
That is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the Ag Issues program here on 580 WIBW.